Hi guys, this is my demo for our hospital database. It's the second time doing it because last time I recorded system audio which had blasting music in the background. So why don't we go ahead and get started. So we have our hospital database right here, and from the previous demo you can see that there is info in the database. So we will be starting from scratch. So these are what these 5 commands up here does. Make sure we're recording. So if a table exists with the given names, which we have here, it'll completely drop them, and that way we'll be able to start from scratch. So for each table you can see the variable, the data type, and some other options such as not null and things like auto increment, which will make logins, things like that much easier. You can see this is our primary key for each of our tables, and for our login table and our treatment table we actually have several foreign keys, which allows us to link this table to the ones above. And lastly, at the bottom we have our first bit of data that we need before I can use the GUI that I've made on Java, as we need a default employer / login. So we have created our first employee called Bob Marley, with the password. So why don't we go ahead and get started. So let's copy all this code into our MySQL workbench. Here I will be able to execute all this and it should modify our database. So why don't we go ahead and do that. So execute all. As you can see below, it completely got rid of all the tables, and insert our 2 rows at the bottom. So why don't we go ahead and refresh the schema, and voila, you can see all the tables. And if we right click on login, we should be able to see one login, which would be for our single employee. And there we go, login ID 1, password, and the credential, which defines what type of user it is for the system. Alright, we can close this and open up Eclipse, which is what I use to create our interface. So MySQL server is running locally on this machine, which is my desktop at home. So it's connected to the local server with the default port. So how I connected my Java to MySQL server was with JDBC, which is a database driver which I found online. If you look under properties, we can see that it is part of our Java build path, MySQL connector Java. From there I can put in the required information, so we can connect to our local host and our default port, which is the same as what it is over here. And when we first created our database, including the 2 other ones that came with it, we have a root and a default password which is needed to log in. From there I think we can start the demonstration. So we can start this, and like I said, so we have our initial employee with ID 1 and password. So why don't we go ahead and log in here. So the employee can only create, update, and delete either new employee profiles, patients, or doctors. So why don't we go ahead and create another employee. Let's call him Sean Pan. at gmail.com. If any of the fields are left empty, that's alright, it just doesn't fill in anything in our database. So why don't we go ahead and create it, and here we go. So we have created a new employee with login ID 2 and password this. So it's auto incrementing in the login ID to make it easy. So why don't we go ahead and write that down. Alright, let's create a patient, which would be me. cron server. Here we go, all this information. No insurance. Alright, here we go. So now we have my login. So if I want to come check out what treatments the doctors prescribe for me, this will be my login, which I will write down safely, and that will be given to me by the employee that creates it. And why don't we go ahead and create a doctor. Let's just call him Dr. Bob. DB. And I'll be a throat specialist. There we go, create that. 4, and I think that's a 0. So that's all the functionality on the employee page. Why don't we go ahead and check that all these have been created in our login table. So let's just refresh it and check our rows, and look at that. We have 4 entries of different patient, employee, doctor, and you can see the credentials which match the type of user they are, so that way I know which GUI to open up when they log in initially. So why don't we go ahead and close this, and let's log in with our second employee to see what it looks like. So we have, oh, I should have written it down, but this is our second employee. You can see that. So again, same interface because it's an employer, same functionality. Boring, so let's move on. So why don't we log in as our doctor, actually, and write some prescriptions for me. So here we can look up our first patient, which would be me. We can look it up. We find out that our patient ID is number 1. So why don't we go ahead and create a treatment, Advil twice a day. Don't need to include the date here really because it takes in the current date. So when we update the treatment, so to look up the treatments for a particular patient, we need to know the ID number, so that's what it is over here. As you can see, I think I had created a treatment before that, but you can see this is Advil twice a day. So why don't I go ahead and modify this, and then we can finally go ahead and delete the first one and see how that all works out. So let's update this to 3 times a day, update, look up, and there we go. We have both of these should be 3 times a day. So let's say Dr. Bob made a mistake and we need to delete the first one. So when we type in Tylenol, and again 3 times a day, the date will automatically be taken into account. So update the treatment and look up, and all we have left is Advil. So why don't we go ahead and look at the same functionality but from a different user case, which would be the patient. So close all this, restart. Now I'm logging in as the patient 3. So this would be how I would log in and see what prescriptions were given to me by my doctor. And here we go. So my patient ID is shown at the top. Right now there's only 1 prescription and the 1 doctor, but this list can go as far down as you want, and it will scroll if it ever gets large enough. And that's about it for that functionality. So why don't we go ahead and look at some of the GUI code and see how the SQL commands were executed. So we have our SQL import here, our connection from our drivers page, which connects us to our local MySQL server, and it needs to be passed in every single GUI for us to be able to create SQL queries. These are just kind of initializing the components here. So when we take a look at the login action performed, so here we kind of write our SQL query, select from, and then plug in our information. That way it'll go ahead, take a look, see what matches. Depending on the credentials, 1, 2, or 3, it'll create a different GUI. Each GUI is being passed my connection, which is the connection to the database, because otherwise none of the SQL commands from those GUIs would ever work. Then we can go ahead and look at patient treatments, which is the one that has the big table. As we saw, there was only a few things, but it is a scrollable table where if you had 100 different treatments, you would be able to see the doctor who prescribed it, the date that it's prescribed on, as well as all the related information. And I think that wraps it up.